Hello, and welcome to Constructive Thinking, a podcast by the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada. I'm Dan Baxter, PCA's Regional Director for British Columbia. Today, we're talking about BC's Community Benefits Agreement policy and why this labour policy is failing contractors, workers, and taxpayers across BC. I'm joined by Ryan Bruce. Ryan is the Government Relations Director at CLAC. For those who may not be familiar, PCA member companies employ workers who are represented primarily by the CLAC union. Welcome, Ryan. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, Dan. I look forward to talking about a topic that I've been closely monitoring for many years now.
Well, that's actually a great place to start. So let's start by rewinding 7 years, almost basically to the month. A sunny day back on July 2018 when BC's then Premier, the late John Horgan, rolled out his government's unique brand of community benefits agreements. Obviously, it'd be great to unpack a little bit about what a community benefit agreement is. But before we get there, I'd like to actually peel back the curtain a bit here and get a sense as we're sitting here in the CLAC office. What happened that day? Did you know that policy was coming? Did you have an inkling of it? When you first read the policy, did you understand exactly what they were trying to do there? Maybe give a little bit of insight from the CLAC perspective when John Horgan announced CBAs.
Yeah, happy to. I guess really to answer that question, I need to go back even further to the day, and it wasn't the day of the election, because if you recall, the BC Liberals did form a short-lived minority government. We all watched that unfold. Well, when ADP took power under the power sharing agreement with the Green Party, at the time that was Andrew Weaver, Sonia Furstenau, and Adam Olsen. I'll be honest, I was watching closely from that day forward on the signals and the signs that the NDP might have been showing that they were going to head in this direction. Obviously, I didn't know they were going to call it a community benefit agreement or they were going to create this crown corporation called BCIB, but I was pretty certain that in the not-so-distant future, we were going to see some form of restrictive tendering, some model public policy that was going to basically, would be a sweetheart deal with their handpicked unions. And so I wasn't surprised. It didn't take long, having been at the press conference at BCIT, it didn't take long to realize what exactly they were trying to do. And it was a little bit of a cloak and dagger or, here's a shiny object called community benefit agreements. Yet if you just take one look at a layer deeper than the shiny object of community benefits, it was very clear to me what they were trying to do. And it was a collective sigh of, oh, no, here we go. At CLAC.
Well, before we got into exactly what the BC version of community benefits agreements are, maybe what we can do is, for some of the listeners out there, is unpack a little bit more what a community benefit agreement is and who is supposed to benefit from those kinds of agreements.
Sure, and I think, the term community benefit, and I give the NDP credit for using this as a way to describe this model. I mean,
hate the game, not the player, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, community benefits sound wonderful, and I think in reality, if you the first sort of glance at a major infrastructure or a public infrastructure project, whether it be a hospital, a road, or a bridge, new expansion of a highway, whatever it is. There is community benefits that are inherently built right into the project itself, right? You build a new hospital, that community hopefully is well served by that brand new, bigger hospital serving the community for many years to come. There is benefit to the community through that project. Now, I think it is important, and governments of all levels should be looking for opportunities to get extra benefits around projects that are paid for through tax dollars. And if there is concerns around underemployed sections of society, whether that's women in the trades or Indigenous hires, if there needs to be a focus on today we have a labor shortage. Everybody is focused on training the future workforce. There should be focus around apprenticeship training and opportunities to take new workers and develop them into skilled trades people. And so it's, the whole idea around community benefits and getting extra value over and above what is the community benefit, the project itself will gain extra value. And if you want to call them community benefits, great. Then, we should be looking for those opportunities. You see that in the private sector with First Nation communities around impact benefit agreements or commitments around employment of Indigenous workers. Those are great opportunities to empower people to lift people up within society and give them an opportunity to thrive.
Well, we were talking a little bit about this idea, like in the Northwest, they have the Northwest Resource Benefit Alliance even, so these are communities where resource companies come in, they're accessing the minerals or the resource in the ground. And of course, what they're looking for is a little extra benefit, whether it's extra community infrastructure, those kinds of things. So adding some extra value, so the community who is impacted by that project, sees some added value, to use your term. So that seems to make sense in terms of, what community benefit agreements are, could be. And, obviously there's great research out there by think tanks like Cardis that really unpack, how if you're going to model a community benefit agreement, if that's what government wants to do, hey, this is the way to do it. So maybe people should try to find that kind of research and figure it out. But community benefits itself, in terms of, like sometimes I wonder, and this is just my take, when we talk about community benefits and saying it's a bad policy here in BC, I kind of feel like people are giving me the eye glance sideways as like, oh, why are you opposed to community benefits? Like, I'm pretty sure we're all for that.
Yeah.
So what makes the BC policy so unfair?
Yeah, well, again, I'll start off by saying I give the NDP a lot of credit for taking this idea around community benefits and presenting the shiny object of, hey, we're going to be able to achieve all these great goals of underrepresented groups and women in trades, as I mentioned, Indigenous workers, local hires. But the added feature that they really didn't focus on much in their press conference, or don't talk about until kind of much later, is that what they're doing through this BC version of a CBA, Community Benefit Agreement, is they are handing a monopoly, a sweetheart deal, to 19 of their handpicked, favored unions. And by doing so, they are cutting out 85% of the construction workforce. The building trades, these 19 unions only represent 15% of the workforce. At a time when we have a labor shortage, at a time when we have an affordability issue, at a time where, these are projects built by taxpayer dollars. The very people who are being cut out are the same people who are paying taxes to build these projects. And they're being told that because you belong to a certain union, or maybe not a union at all, you're not welcome to work on this project. Unless, of course, you are willing to sign a union card with one of these chosen unions. Now, just to add to that a little further, we have a right in this country to unionize, and I think that's a right that we should all have. Yeah. And I would fight for that. I think that's really important. But part of that right is also to unionize with the union of your choice. Yeah. And so now you've got the government dictating to you, not only that you have to unionize, but you have to unionize with a specific union if you want to access work on projects that are within your own community, paid for by your own tax dollars.
So maybe this is a good point, because we're talking about, again, community benefits agreements. Again, it sounds, really nice. It's motherhood, it's apple pie. But really, how do these agreements differ from just restricted project labor agreements? Is this basically a policy, that is just been dressed up? Is it just basically a restricted PLA?
Well, that was, what I mentioned earlier, that I wasn't quite sure how they were going to do it. But, just reflecting back to the 1990s, the Island Highway Project, they used the kind of the project labor agreement, the closed project labor agreement, which is sort of like being honest with what you're doing. It isn't sort of dressing it up, putting lipstick on a pig and saying we're going to get all these wonderful things, but actually what we're doing is limiting who can work on it. They were more honest in their approach back then than they are now. But yeah, so a project labor agreement is minus all the community benefits, the same outcome in that they are predetermining which unions can operate and work on these projects. There's another model they rolled out at one point called the Special Project Needs Agreement, which again sounds like there's something more, something special about this procurement model. But the same thing was you had to belong to a certain group of unions. And it's an egregious policy, especially in this day and age when you do have competition in the labor movement. And you have non-union, you have your kind of old school traditional unions, and then you've got a more modern progressive labor model in the middle that is neither one or the other, but is equally important in how we build our infrastructure and what helps actually to be quite honest, drive productivity in the country.
Yeah, and maybe take a couple minutes there, just unpack a little bit more about, this labor landscape in BC. But I think where you're going with this is the impact. This, I think we can, it sounds like on the surface is a bad policy, a bad labor policy that has its limits. What's the impact, by restricting labor on projects, public infrastructure projects like this?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, let me articulate or share some of the nuances of the differences between the labor models, so people can understand. Again, there isn't just one labor model. The CLAC model is one that's built on cooperation. It's built on, our goal is to build a positive working relationship between our members and their employer. Uh-huh. And while there was a time, in the 1950s and perhaps even time now with certain employers where you do need to fight, and there is a sort of an adversarial approach required to protect workers' rights. But by and large, out there today, the world has shifted. We've got employment standards. We've got this recognition that work and a company and a group of employers, there's a symbiotic relationship between the two. You don't have a company unless you have employers. You don't have jobs unless you have people willing to open up a company and invest and build and grow something. So it makes sense to work together. And that's where we start our labor model is based on, is that cooperation, that desire to want to build a cooperative working relationship between the two. Now, a layer deeper beyond that, there are very practical differences between our model of labor relations and the building trade model. One is our collective agreements are wall-to-wall. Mm-hmm. So we represent all the trades across a collective agreement. That means a company, pick a construction company, they work with one union under our model, CLAC, and we represent all the trades and have them built under one collective agreement. So there's an ability for them to manage their workforce far more efficiently because they're all actually working together. We don't limit our ability for our electrical members and our laborers and our carpenters and our, pipe fitters. We encourage cooperation even in the work site. Obviously, we have to draw lines between skills that are needed to be safe on the work site and certain requirements around, just understanding the trade in general. But there's plenty of opportunity for cooperation to happen in the work site, which allows our companies to be more efficient in how they deploy their workforce.
Well, and a great example, we were here for one of our meetings with an MP, and, an example one of your team members highlighted was on one project, the electricians finished up their portion of the work, the project. Yeah. They need to get to insulating, but there wasn't enough insulators. So basically the company, the project managers basically said to the electricians, hey, why don't you stick around for another 6 months? Come here. If you need any upskilling, we can upskill you, make sure you understand what goes into insulating and doing it, and you get basically another 6 months worth of work. Would something like that that kind of innovation be possible? Using a traditional labor model, through the building trades?
Never, just based on the fact that their unions are siloed between trades, and so. The old kind of story we've all heard of the electrician who's not allowed to move the lumber out of the way to get to the wall to do the electrical. They have to wait for a laborer or a carpenter to come and move that lumber. Mm-hmm. That plays out. The jurisdictional disputes between whose work it is something that plays out on a regular basis. They have line items in their collective agreements that contractors have to pay into to deal with grievances that are going to be taken to the labor board to argue over whose work it is. And so understanding construction and the life of a project from one trade to another, not only do our contractors have the ability to manage their workforce more efficiently, we also encourage our members to think about multi-skilling. And get skills out, makes them more employable. We've got a labor shortage, so it allows them to contribute more and longer to projects, the life of a project, because projects often go from one trade to the next, and so they can stay with that project for a longer period of time and remain employed longer. And so, there are inherent sort of, like our model has inherent efficiencies baked right into it that the other don't have. And so if you limit our ability to participate on these public projects, you lose those efficiencies. Mm-hmm. And furthermore, you don't just limit CLAC and CLAC members, you're also limiting a group of contractors to bid on these projects. Yeah. And once you start doing that, then you're limiting competition. Yeah. And if you limit competition, then as taxpayers, inevitably, we're paying far more for these projects than we should be otherwise.
So let's unpack that, because obviously up to this point of the conversation, we've been really highlighting how a community benefits agreement here in BC, which really, you take away all the window dressing. It's just a restricted project labor agreement. It's about, I think you used the term, a sweetheart deal for unions that are politically favored by the government of the day. And, but obviously there's another element here, that there's a third kind of, leg to this conversation, and that's the taxpayer. What do we find when we restrict, when we restrict these, this labor pool, access to labor, how does it make it more expensive to build projects, public projects?
Well, first, maybe I'll say it's a difficult message to convey because, you and I both know, Dan, people aren't waking up in the morning concerned about the procurement models on a public infrastructure project that the government is deploying.
They're not.
Can you believe it? But so that's always been our challenge. And secondary, you've got this, this title, community benefit agreement.
Yeah.
So right away you're countering this when you're trying to explain to people, why this should be important to them or to the impact to them as taxpayers. You're already behind the eight ball because people don't care because they don't understand. And number two, they've got the community benefit agreements. Who can argue with that, right? But the reality is, we have an affordability crisis in this country. I think we've all recognized that. Even before the inflationary pressures we've seen as a result of COVID. Also now we've got a trade war going on. But we have governments that continue to layer tax upon tax upon tax, and it is getting unaffordable. And so, from my perspective, when I send the government money through taxes that I pay, I expect that they're going to use that money and get the best value for what it is they're going to do with it. If they're going to build a road, I expect that they're going to go out there, they're going to build a nice, beautiful new road that we can drive on, yes, but I expect they're going to get good value for the work that's being done to actually build that road. And what the government is doing is saying to basically the taxpayers that they don't really care about that. They're not willing to create the necessary sort of climate in terms of bidding on projects and participation on these projects that is going to drive good value for their tax dollars. Yeah. And I think we just can't see it anymore. Even the public sector unions, who are all up for negotiations right now as we're going through a cycle of negotiating all the public sector contracts. If they truly understood the amount of waste that's happening on the public infrastructure that's being built in this province, they'd be in a far better position themselves to get the kind of increases they would hope to get if we weren't wasting money on billions of dollars of infrastructure projects.
So when you talk about waste on public projects, really, I think what you're trying to get to is around cost and cost overruns. When you restrict your labor force to only 15% of the construction workforce, cutting out 85%, in a time of labor shortage, you just don't have enough workers, and that generally leads to increased costs. And what would you say? What would you kind of go to talk about in terms of what that cost overrun looks like on major public infrastructure projects?
Yeah, well, we've chatted about this a number of times. There's lots of reasons why projects go over budget, right? Supply chain issues, trade wars, and we're in the middle of one. Just unforeseen circumstances that crop up. Labor is a big part of it. In the government's own documents around cost overruns on certain projects, they've identified a shortage of labor as a reason for costs and delays, right? And delays result in costs. You pay more for a project every month that it's delayed. You continue to pay for that project during the construction phase. And so if you are, as a government, have a policy that's limiting those who can participate on a public project, you're basically setting yourself up to start the project off with the numbers on the back of a napkin that Von Palmer have come up with are roughly 20%. The government's own admission when they released this whole policy at their press conference was 7%. Well, 7% is great. If they said 7, it's going to easily be 14. And really, when you start to dive into it, it's probably much more than that.
Yeah.
They created a whole new crown corporation to become the employer for the workers in construction. In what world does that make sense?
Well, it's interesting you bring up the BCIB, which was created to replace what the employers already do as part of their business model. We hire, we train, that is the function of a business, is to do that human resources. And government said, no, we can do this better, Yeah. And you see BCIB over the last number of years. I think, this past year, was a $240 million budget. The fiscal year coming up, 2025-26, is going to be $280 million. It's probably been about that, for the last kind of 4 or 5 years. It's been up at that 200 million, and not to out any government people, but said, oh, that's not going to cost, that doesn't cost the payers anything. It's cost recovery. Well, that cost recovery comes from someone. That's a business that is paying for it. And where do? They don't generally just eat a cost. A cost added on by government usually gets incorporated into the cost of that project, so it is effectively being paid for by government. Right there, do you think, I guess, in that sense, and you talked about the government saying initially it was a 7% impact. In fact, in that article you talked about that Von Palmer wrote back in 2019 on the first project that was under CBA, the Kick in North Canyon, the government actually tried to pass it off as a 5.8% increase. And you're right, Von shrewdly kind of deconstructed that argument. I guess my question to you, Ryan, is do you think the government's being upfront about this public policy?
Well, based on what it's clear they're trying to do, they're not. And
what are they trying to do? Like, I guess that's the thing. Are they being clear with what they're trying to do with it?
Well, that's just okay. So if BCIB, the Crown Corporation, BC Infrastructure Benefits, and CBA's Community Benefit Agreements were so great, why are we starting to see projects that aren't under the CBA model? Now they're stripping all the community benefit aspect of the program and simply tendering projects under a closed project labor agreement. And the single purpose of a closed project labor agreement is to award the project to their select hand-picked unions. And so, like, from the very beginning, CBAs, sort of dressed up as a wonderful thing for communities, was simply in their minds an opportunity. And the building trades had the pen on it. They were writing the policy. They were giving themselves the monopoly, if you will, on public infrastructure projects. And so that, in my view, it's so clear to me that that's what they are intending to do. And they're turning themselves into pretzels trying to make sure that can happen. So they're not being upfront about it. They're not being upfront about the cost. They don't even release the true costs of any projects nowadays to limit their exposure and transparency around the cost of public infrastructure projects.
Well, it's interesting. You talk about limiting their exposure and twisting themselves into pretzels. You're all right in terms of the most recent number of projects, Patello Bridge, Broadway SkyTrain Station, Cowichan Hospital. Those are all CBA projects. Where are the issues? They say it's inflation. And I think it will get inflation happened. It was rampant there for a while. Supply chain issues. Yeah, again, that on the surface makes sense. Coming out of COVID, there was a lot of disruption on the supply chain, and that definitely has an impact on getting access to materials. But by their own admission, and this is where sometimes government, in their own, maybe sometimes they're on, trying to just, dismiss things. They sometimes let truth slip out. They recognize labor shortages was actually, a big reason. Access to labor was a big reason for cost overruns. But here we have a policy that actually, to your point, restricts them, accessing the full workforce to get all hands on deck to build this infrastructure.
Yeah.
I guess where I go with that, again, like, how do we, how did the government end up in this boat? You kind of alluded to it. And I want to kind of go back to something you said about the NDP and the Greens. We talked about, this is 2017 or 2018 when they first came in. They had a power sharing agreement with the Greens. Do you think the Greens would have gone along with this, basically a naked, reward my friends, my political friends, the sweetheart deal, if it was just called that, a restricted project labor agreement? Yeah, we're going to reward our friends here who support us politically. Or do you think community benefits agreement as it existed or exists today was basically a matter of political expedience for an agreement between the Greens to get their support?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think, love him or hate him, I think Weaver was he's a fair politician. I think he true to who he was. I think he was one that was seeking fairness across, and certainly didn't have the kind of political ideology of the NDP, and certainly and he also didn't have the strong ties to labor one way or another. So, I mean, as an example of that, for instance, when the labor code review took place under that power sharing agreement, the panel that did that review, that took 6 months or 8 months and toured the province, and every union and every company, everybody who wanted to have a say on changes to the labor code had that opportunity. The panel came back with the recommendations, and Weaver said at that time, I will support what the panel came back with, right? And so when the NDP presented it to him in a briefing, they made one minor little tweak, but it wasn't so minor. It was something that, unless you are kind of really in the labor movement and understand the labor code, you wouldn't have picked up on it. When we went and met with him, it was all around open season. We met with Weaver and we explained to him the significance of this change, to which he was told it was exactly as the panel had recommended. And he was very upset. He felt like he was lied to by the NDP, and he totally held the line on that. He did not support he supported an amendment to turn it back to what the panel had recommended. And so to your point about whether or not they were trying to, put lipstick on a pig to get the Green support, I think there probably is something to that. I think, like I say, Weaver probably would have held the line on that had he truly understood the significance of this policy. And I just want to share, the CBA portion, especially as it relates to Indigenous involvement in construction, again, something we fully support. But you don't have to go much further than a gentleman named John Coleman on the Cowichan District Hospital. John is Cowichan. He owned a Cowichan construction company. He had a contract on the project to do land clearing, the early stages of the project. And after a month of he and his employees being on there, the building trade showed up as part of the CBA deal and started forcing everybody to sign cards, to which they said, no, we won't. We're not signing cards. His employees didn't want to be unionized. He didn't want to be unionized. In the end of the day, he got his contracts ripped up and he got kicked off of the project. This is a CBA which was intended to employ Indigenous workers.
Yeah.
And an entire company, virtually all Indigenous workers were kicked off the project. It's totally egregious.
Well, again, that's kind of, I think you're highlighting a great point that, when this policy came in, the NDP made all kinds of promises when it was first announced, and again, a big part of that was, again, inclusion of more women, inclusion of Indigenous peoples. And clearly the minute, the policy started to rub against which was probably the true intent of it, going back to their fact that it's not really a community benefit agreement, which, if done right, can be okay. And businesses generally been okay with trying to figure out, you want more women? Yeah, of course we want more women. We need more workers, more Indigenous people. Yeah, local hire, of course. Like that's way more cost effective than having to ship, fly people in onto projects and camp them and all those sorts of things. But right there, it's a great example of a project, CBA project, that once the actual intent of the policy hit the rubber on the road, that was Indigenous relations, you start to see exactly what the true intent of the policy was.
Yeah.
As we start to wrap up here, Ryan, I just think we're 7 years on. It's been nice over the past 7 years. We've seen, obviously, lots of things happen to infrastructure. We had seen floods, fires, global pandemics, surge in inflation. Obviously, we're dealing with massive deficits. Any one of these you would think would be enough for the government to basically course correct on a policy that isn't in the general benefit of the taxpayer, of the residents of BC. What do you think it would take, for the government to scrap this coercive deal, this costly deal, and kind of right the ship, so to speak? And how do you think you guys at CLAC are going to kind of handle it over the next few months, years, as we try to make those changes?
Well, I'm not sure the government is prepared to course correct on this. We've tried over many years to meet to bring some common sense to the discussion. We've had petitions, letter writing campaigns. We had a legal challenge in the early days with a group of allies. It was a charter challenge based on freedom of association. The government lawyers did a great job confusing the issue, making it sound a lot more like a labor relations exercise as opposed to a charter challenge. And so the courts, a confused mind says kind of go somewhere else, which is what they did. They kicked us back to the labor board. It's not a labor board issue. This is a charter issue around freedom of association. This is about a worker's right to choose which union they want to belong to or not at all. And this is a taxpayer issue. I think when people actually wake up and realize that they're paying in the neighborhood of 20% more for the infrastructure that's being built, and just it's hard for people to fathom the kind of numbers we're talking about. Because we're talking about billions of dollars of public infrastructure that needs to be built, that is underway right now. And even if it's a 7%, it's egregious when you start a project 7% behind. But we know it's far more than that. So we're like 20% behind. How many more schools can you get as a result of that? The de-scoping of projects is another big issue. We end up getting less infrastructure on a project. The Patello Bridge replacement, the initial budget on that was the bridge and all the feeder roads into it, the highways, the on-ramps and off-ramps. Well, suddenly now we're paying more for just the bridge, and the others, all the feeder highways in there are a second project. So now we're getting less infrastructure for more money. And when people wake up and say enough is enough of this kind of policy, perhaps that's the time when we can see some change. Or perhaps when the government falls ultimately and people have had enough entirely of the NDP.
Well, and, history has a way of repeating itself. It's interesting you bring up the Vancouver Island Highway project and you're talking about less infrastructure for more money.
Yeah.
There's a great example. I don't know anyone who's driven that highway. I'm sure we've all done it when you get off the ferry and you're trying to head up Island through Nanaimo and it's light after light after light.
Yeah.
That was never the initial scope of that project. It was meant to be a bypass, grade separated, so cars can just zip up the highway and get to places like Comox and north of the island. Yeah. But because of a CBA policy that restricted labor, it was all meant to reward their the select friends of the government of the day, the NDP government. It ended up with a lot of traffic lights along there to stay on budget.
Yeah.
And of course, they still ended up over budget. And of course, we're seeing that now today. You mentioned Massey Tunnel. We were talking about or thinking about Massey Tunnel.
Yeah.
There's a great example now. It's not part of the CBA project. It's one of those new special needs or special project needs agreements, which is, again, all the same restrictive project labor agreements, restricting labor to select unions. And we went from going to have a 10-lane bridge for $3 billion to now an 8-lane tunnel for $3.5 billion. And that's $3.5 billion if we're lucky.
Yeah.
You've seen, the Patello Bridge over budget, behind schedule. You've seen the Broadway SkyTrain station over budget and behind schedule.
Yeah.
And you're right. Those are all basically projects and dollars, taxpayer dollars, that could be going to fund more beds, more police on the ground, lowering our taxes, or keeping our debt affordable so our kids aren't paying it off.
More schools in Surrey.
More schools in Surrey, for instance. So, yeah. Well, Ryan, I think we really gave a lot of food for thought here. I do want to thank you for joining us. And again, hopefully we've helped kind of open the eyes for some people out there to be more advocates on this, really demand, the government to basically just let everyone, when it comes to public sector infrastructure, those taxpayer-funded projects, to get working on them and build BC and do it in a way that respects our dollars and means that we can keep more of it in our pocket, hopefully.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the issue, and we'll continue raising the issue where we can.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan.